Falling for the Governess.
Written by Abby Ayles and published by Starfall Publications. Book from the Duke's Ladies series. Save more with our ebook and audiobook bundles on our website, starfallpublicationsbooks.com. Subscribe for more audiobooks. Enjoy.
Prologue. My dearest Louisa, I fear my heart is broken. It is with the saddest news I find myself writing to you today. Just yesterday I received a visit from Mr. Jenkins, my father's lawyer. As you know, my father was on a ship set for the Cayman Islands in relation to his import business. As I had mentioned a few times at our last meeting, I was becoming exceedingly concerned since his vessel had not yet returned. Without any ill news, I hoped that they had only been delayed by poor wind and calm waters. Unfortunately, this is not the case. While in the tropics, Father contracted a most dreadful fever. His most experienced sailors fell ill. To prevent the sickness from spreading, ill people were to be left behind to recover and return home with another vessel. My father was too prominent a figure to just leave behind, and the MHS Poseidon decided to stay in the Cayman Islands for a fortnight to allow him to recover. I am told the fever passed. For that, I am grateful. But why did my stubborn father have to push himself? I don't know how to feel. You are aware of how much I disliked him going on these journeys to begin with. Having gained his strength back, Father sailed Poseidon homeward, but his health took a turn for the worse. The ship's surgeon did all he could to help, but in the end, it was not enough. My father passed away a little over a month ago in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There's nothing I could have done, and I resent myself for that. Mr. Jenkins, having been informed himself just last night upon the arrival of the ship, came to bear me the sorrowful news this morning. He assured me that my father had the most lavish and honourable burial at sea that could be mustered for the situation. I am so overcome with confusion and sorrow. It is a wonder that I can compose myself to scribe such a letter to you. Though father was always very busy with his business and adventures, he was a loving and attentive man. I feel my life vastly emptier without the assured knowledge that though he may be away, he will always return home here to Rosewater House. Mr. Jenkins has also informed me that I will need to come to his offices on the morrow to discuss my father's estate and, I suppose to some effect, what is to become of me. I cannot even imagine being able to subject myself to conversations of financial and worldly status when my heart is so full of turmoil. It is for this reason that I must offer my deepest regrets to inform you that I will not be able to accompany your excellent mother to tea. Please tell Lady Gilchrist that I send my deepest regrets. I hope that I will see you very soon, my dear Louisa, so that I may receive comfort from the words of wisdom you always seem to use so deftly. With humble heart as Isabella. The next evening, Isabella received a return letter from Lady Lydia in the 5 o'clock post. My dearest Isabella, it is with the heaviest of hearts that I give you my deepest condolences on your loss. I have informed her ladyship of your necessity for absence from her humble event tomorrow afternoon. Though you will be greatly missed by not only my mother but all those who are to attend, we all understand your need for time to quietly reflect and compose yourself. Please do not fear for your well-being. Your father was a good man, and I am confident that he will provide for you even after the untimely event of his death. As soon as you are able, I invite you to my residence so that I may be able to comfort my dearest friend in her time of need. Your humble friend, Louisa. Chapter 1. Isabella's eyes wandered lazily as she sat in Louisa's comfortable drawing room. It was the smallest drawing room of her dear friend's London residence, used for entertaining very intimate friends of the ladies of the house. Isabella was struggling to collect her thoughts or even know where to begin after the events that had transpired over the last 2 days. She did her best to keep her trembling hands clasped in the lap of her dark black cotton dress. Her hand rattled the teacup just slightly when she took it from Louisa's loving hands. Isabella was happy for the privacy such an intimate setting provided. She wasn't sure if she would be able to hold her composure as she retold Louisa all that had transpired. I scarcely know where to begin, she said. after taking a small sip of courage. She didn't have much appetite at the moment, but felt the tea might help to clear her head. The last few nights had been restless and anything but rejuvenating. Start with when you arrived at Mr. Jenkins's offices yesterday. I am quite sure we will find a way to untangle any mess you may now find yourself in, Louisa responded calmly. She was just 2 years older than Isabella, but not the slightest in comparison to physical beauty. Where Isabella had rich, shiny black locks and emerald green eyes, Louisa had mouse-brown hair, which rarely plaited as it should, and ordinary brown eyes. It did not prevent them from finding an inseparable bond as young girls at the prestigious Mrs. Mason's School for Exceptional Young Ladies. Louisa had always been a quiet child who often kept to herself. Isabella, on the other hand, was openly pleasant to be around and was commonly found at the centre of the conversation, entertaining the other ladies of the school with wild tales heard from her father's adventures. Louisa at first had listened quietly to her tales, but Isabella saw more to Louisa than her shy exterior. Much as Isabella had expected, Louisa was the most kind and giving young lady she had ever met. Her friendship and confidant was something she treasured all through her youth and young adulthood. I suppose you're right, Isabella responded with a steadying breath before setting the tea down. I arrived at Mr. Jenkins's office yesterday morning. I was surprised when I was shown in to find Mr. Smith already there. Mr. Smith? Your father's horrid business partner, Louisa clarified, and Isabella nodded in agreement. I had done my best to avoid him at all costs since that dreadful event 4 years ago. It gave me quite a shock, as it had not been mentioned to me that he would be there. Though now looking back on it, it was certainly reasonable that he should be there, as we discussed my father's estate. Of course, you are not expected to have the clearest of minds in such a time, Louisa said, attempting to erase any guilt Isabella might feel on her state of propriety. That awful man, Isabella stated, now with her green eyes full of anger. He didn't even stand at my entrance, and in truth, I didn't see him at all from his chair at the back of the office till Mr. Jenkins motioned to him during the conversation. Isabella thought back to that horrible meeting 4 years earlier. She had been barely 17 at the time, having completed her schooling and finished her first season out among society. It was a small dinner party that her father was having at their very own Rosewater house. She had been all aglow with the excitement of her season and the joy of having her father momentarily home with her. Mr. Smith was there, of course, since he was Baron Leinster's closest friend and business partner. Isabella had not paid him much attention, as he was even older than her father, and she could never imagine him having interest in such a young girl. As the evening transpired, however, Mr. Smith found a chance to enter into a private conversation with Isabella. It was then he requested that she should consider him a suitor and accept his proposal of marriage. Isabella was so shocked by the declaration that all she managed to say was, "But you are so old." It was probably not the most polite thing for her to say, but so often when she was shocked, she tended to speak truths without thinking. Isabella was young and full of spirit. She had received much attention from various social gatherings of the season. She was not so conceited enough to think she was above those outside the peerage. Isabella had always assumed that with her father's honorary title, she would find herself a gentleman in the society she had been raised to be a part of. Of course, having affection for her future husband was a necessity for her. His status had not been. Even so, she would never have imagined marrying such an older, coarse man at such a young age. She did her best to regain her composure and thank Mr. Smith, but politely decline. He became enraged by her very respectable but negative answer, and made quite a scene of it. From that day on, Isabella had done everything in her power not to be in the company of Mr. Smith. It was not always an easy task when he had such close financial relationships with her father. Mr. Jenkins informed me that my father had left his import and export business to Mr. Smith. I suppose that seems reasonable enough, Louisa said. After all, as partner, it would only be right that he inherit the whole of the business. And I suppose you are to be left Rosewater House and a living? That is the worst of it. Mr. Jenkins informed me that all of my father's estates had been specifically put in the charge of Mr. Smith, having no other male family member. He then informed me that my father had also collected a large sum of debts. She lowered her voice. Gambling. Oh dear. Had you any idea of these debts? I was aware of his enjoyment of gentlemanly horse races. I suspected the thrill of it was much like that of a boy crossing the sea, but I had no idea that he was in such a poor situation. What does this mean? Louisa asked with fear in her soft eyes. Well, Mr. Jenkins said that he had been in conference with Mr. Smith all morning and had made several arrangements. That moment, when she finally looked over her shoulder to find Mr. Smith sitting behind her, would most likely haunt her for the rest of her days. He had stood then and walked forward, wholly unearthing himself from the morning shadows that the windowless office provided. He was much older now than would be expected for the 4 years that had passed since his proposition. His hair was long and straggly on the sides and completely missing on top. Instead of choosing to wear a wig, he tied the straggled strands back with a ribbon. His face was worn and marked by the years he, himself, had spent as captain on a merchant ship before striking business with Baron Leinster. Though his clothes were of a gentlemanly style, they were outworn and dusty. The edges of his coat were stained with dirt. Undoubtedly, his lifelong bachelorhood had led to the inferior care of his outward appearance. He smiled smugly, showing his blackened tooth, something she remembered quite clearly from her first encounter with him. Quite awkwardly, Mr. Jenkins had fiddled with some paperwork on his desk. He was a rather young man for his position, only recently taken on by her father. Her interactions with him, however few, had always been enjoyable ones. Usually he had a jolly expression in his eyes, especially since the birth of his first child. Isabella wasn't sure she had ever seen Mr. Jenkins so uncomfortable, even when he had informed her of her father's passing. As the benefactor of your father's estate, Mr. Smith here has decided to sell all assets in order to pay off the debts incurred, including Rosewater House and everything in it. But that is my home, Isabella said with a raised voice. Where am I to live? Isabella could not bear to take her eyes off Mr. Jenkins, to turn to the scoundrel behind her. Most certainly he was enjoying the destitute situation he had put her in. I have spoken of this very concern with Mr. Smith at length, Mr. Jenkins replied, obviously understanding her fear. He feels, as sole proprietor, he is, and I rightly agree, responsible for your safety and security. Isabella stood up from her spot, forgetting all dignity. I won't marry him. Mr. Jenkins looked at her apologetically, whether from the necessity of marriage between a senior man and a young lady of 21 years or other less favourable options, she wasn't sure. Though I suggested such an arrangement for the sake of your comfort, I was informed that such arrangements were no longer... He hesitated to try to find the words. No longer a possibility unless... Mr. Jenkins gave a horribly painful sigh. He would like you to ask him to take you in. Absolutely not, Isabella stated, still standing, trembling with fear and embarrassment. She could hear the tone of disgust behind her, but refused to turn to look at him. Before you speak, Miss Isabella, I encourage you to consider your situation. Mr. Smith does intend to sell all valuable possessions. Even so, it will just barely cover your father's debts. Without such an arrangement, I cannot imagine how you will see to your comfortable lifestyle. Then I shan't live as I have thus far. I am willing to be more frugal with my life. Am I not allowed some sort of income from my father's business? I did discuss such matters with Mr. Smith in the event that you did not want to, abide by his requirements. He agreed a yearly income was only fair since, after all, he was named your protector. The sum he agreed on was, well, it was £50 a year. £50 a year? Isabella now turned to face Mr. Smith. It is half his yearly wage. though you wouldn't know it by the way he lived. And it is quite generous considering I will most likely need to take on another partner, Mr. Smith spat back indignantly. He had quite the smug look on his face as he rocked back and forth on his heels, hands pleasantly clasped in front of him. What was torturous to say for the lawyer and unbelievable to hear for Isabella was quite enjoyable for this horrible man. He had positively backed her into a corner. With such a small amount, there was no possible way for Isabella to live alone. It wouldn't even support a house staff of just 1 or 2 servants. He had meant it to force her to beg before him for that which she had denied him all those years ago. "Good heavens, Izzy, what did you do?" Louisa asked as she listened, horrified and enraptured by the retelling. "Well, I refused to give in to his boorish demands. I told him I would find a way to settle on such low income, and that was the end of that. I will starve to death before I give that man the benefit of seeing me grovel at his feet." "But Izzy, without a home or any possessions of your own, how will you do it?" "Well, after I announced I would not give in to the wretched blackguard, Mr. Smith stormed out of the room, slamming the door quite loudly behind him. Mr. Jenkins, the poor man, began apologising profusely, saying that if there were anything he could do to help me, he would." "Well, what is there to be done, Izzy?" "I thought on this fact for the better part of last night. I have come to one conclusion. I will need to find myself some sort of employment." "Certainly not," Louisa asked with surprise, though Isabella could already see the wheels turning in her head, that this was the likely alternative. "I think we both know that this is how it must be," Isabella said with a defeated tone. "It is either that or giving in to Mr. Smith. My pride, however sinful to keep, will not allow such a thing. I will not be offended at all if at such a declaration you find yourself unable to keep my company." "Absolutely not," Louisa said, using a firm tone. "You are my dearest friend. You were the only one who cared to spend time with me when we were together at school. I would never abandon you, no matter the cost." "Not even if I am a lowly scullery maid?" Isabella asked, tears welling in her eyes. In all honesty, she had spent the whole night not just thinking about a life of employment, but terrified of the fact that she had no idea what employable skills she had. Though she may have been born on the lower side of the peerage, her father had never spared her a comfort, and she feared she could not even dress on her own, let alone take on tasks. "You will be no such thing," Louisa said firmly. She placed her own small, delicate hands in Isabella's lap and began to ponder. "I understand now why you have come to me. We will most certainly find something that would be suitable for your position. But I don't have a position. I am free of status now and completely destitute, without any skills at hand." "Of course you have skills," Louisa encouraged. "Why, you were always one of the top performers in our school. Do you not remember? Mrs. Mason would have you stand and recite your French lessons before prospective students." "Why, that is it," Louisa said with the light of a plan. "You could easily find employment as a governess." Isabella thought this new idea over for a bit. She unquestionably had loved school and taken to it quickly. She was accomplished enough in her educational knowledge as well as music and other various genteel talents. She could certainly teach such things to young lords and ladies. Of course, it was a definite step down from being one of the peerage to serving and educating them. It was not as low as the serving class, but somewhere in between. Between her employment and her small allowance, Isabella would most certainly be able to manage on her own. "Do you think I would be hired as such? Mr. Jenkins did offer to help me find employment when I found myself in need of it." "Of course. I am quite sure that Mrs. Mason would also be happy to give you a shining reference. You could most likely find a home here in London to instruct pupils at, and we could still be close friends." "Oh, my dear Louisa, I fear wishing so much good fortune to happen at this time in my life is much like wishing to catch a star. I will be quite satisfied with any position and your continued friendship, even if through correspondence only." "Have faith, Izzy," Louisa said, reaching across the small table of tea and taking Isabella's hands. "We will find a way to overcome this hurdle together. Certainly it isn't something to worry about now. The season is almost upon us. Mr. Smith certainly won't put you out till after. It will give you an opportunity to more earnestly search for a match and perhaps escape all the necessity for such talk. I hope you're right, Louisa, Isabella responded, giving her a grateful squeeze of the hand in return. I was frightened by his rage upon my declaration not to heed his request. I am almost certain he will do everything in his power to hinder my progress at every turn. Chapter 2. The following week, Isabella made her way back to Mr. Jenkins's office after receiving a note that he had found a suitable position for her. She had been reassured by Louisa that she would have at least the season to see if she could come up with a better course of action before settling on being a governess. It was not to be the case. Sadly, no more than a week after finding out about her father's untimely death, Mr. Smith had visited Rosewater House. There he had informed Miss Isabella that she would have only a month to collect items and vacate her home. He then proceeded to boldly go through the house, solicitor in tow, informing her of what things he planned to sell. Isabella hadn't informed the servants yet of the impending liquidation of her father's estates. Mr. Smith even went boldly into Isabella's own room and rifled through her belongings. Mr. Smith announced he would be procuring all her belongings, including dresses and jewellery. The solicitor, embarrassed, hastily suggested that such tactics were not necessary to the closing of the amount owed. Mr. Smith reluctantly allowed Isabella to keep her clothing, but still required all jewellery be turned over to him for selling. She didn't have much in the way of fancy jewellery. Therefore, she didn't care much for giving it up if it meant not allowing Mr. Smith the satisfaction of seeing her beg him for marriage. Her hardest items to part with were the silver comb her father had stated her mother wore on their wedding day, the small gold band that was her mother's wedding ring, and a silver chain with a locket of her mother's hair which she wore around her neck always. It had been a gift from her father on her 16th birthday. Having never met her mother, for she had passed in childbirth, any stories or items her father shared with her were cherished. After taking all belongings worth selling on the spot, including the ring and comb, and informing Isabella that they would be back in a month, for the third time, to take possession of the house, Mr. Smith set his evil eyes on the locket around her neck. Isabella defiantly clasped her hand around it. This was one thing Isabella would not allow to be taken from her. Would Mr. Smith really stoop to such a level of evil? Luckily, the solicitor interjected. I believe we should allow Miss Watts to collect herself. I am sure it has been a very tiring day for her. We can always come back to collect any other items upon the sale of the establishment. Mr. Smith had reluctantly agreed and left. Not a minute after the front door shut on the two men, Isabella crumpled to the hall floor in a heap of sorrowful tears. Her kind maid, who must have also been beside herself to learn that she would be without a situation in a month's time, helped Isabella up to her room to lie down. It was clear that she would not have time to find a better end to her situation. The next day, Isabella inquired of Mrs. Mason for a letter of character reference and delivered it to Mr. Jenkins that same day. She wrung her hands for the next week, waiting for word from Mr. Jenkins. She had no idea if anyone would ever accept a governess at her age without any prior employment references. Mr. Jenkins had assured her that he would do everything in his power to see her well settled. She had felt so blessed to have such a willing friend to help her in her time of need. The time had come when a letter arrived stating that Mr. Jenkins had found her a station of employment. She made it to his office the following day in haste. Isabella was dreading and desperate to know what establishment she would be employed at for the remainder of her days. Would she find herself teaching in a girls' establishment just as she herself had attended? Or would some member of her peerage take pity on her and take her on for the benefit of his children's private education? She sat nervously across from Mr. Jenkins. I must confess I had a harder time finding a situation for you than expected. You see, most of the lady schools in London were well staffed. Mrs. Mason did express in her letter, had she the room, she would have happily taken you on. It was something that Isabella had expected. There were often more ladies seeking employment than available opportunities for suitable work. A part of her wanted to feel slightly shocked or betrayed that not one of those in her acquaintance here in London had tried to take her on for employment. She was no longer a member of that society, however, and would not be seen as someone to have around. I am sorry to say that the situation I found for you is far outside of London. I know you had expected to stay in the area, and I did my very best to do so, but he trailed off. It is quite all right. I know you did your very best, Mr. Jenkins, and I am very grateful for all your efforts. I am sure that no matter the location, I will find my situation quite adequate. I am glad to hear your brave words. The position is for the Duke of Wintercrest. He has taken on a small ward over the last year, a young woman, I believe, and is seeking a governess for her. He specifically asked for a lady of London breeding to prepare her for society, as well as provide her with a strong understanding of the French language. Isabella, of course, knew of the Duke and Duchess of Wintercrest, though she had never had the honour of making their acquaintance. She was aware that they were relatively older in age with children of their own, and therefore questioned who this young ward might be, perhaps a relation they willingly took on. It seems that it might be an ideal position for me, just as I thought when I was told of it. The Duke is also willing to give a much more significant pay than often given for a governess, £40 a year. I had assumed that you would be willing to take the position since they were in need fairly soon. I took the liberty to tell them that you would accept the position. I hope that is fine. It is quite all right. I suspect it is more than I could otherwise hope for, and I thank you for all your hard work on my behalf. I am glad to hear it, Mr. Jenkins said, relaxing into his normally happy face. As I said, they are in need of a governess right away and have made transportation arrangements for you. You will travel by public coach in 2 days' time. I must warn you to pack relatively lightly, as there is not much room in such situations, and dress comfortably, for that matter. You will be spending 2 nights on the road during your travels. A 3-day travel? Forgive me. But where exactly do the Duke and Duchess of Wintercrest live? Yes, that. It is quite far north, just a day's ride south of Edinburgh. Is it in Scotland, then? Isabella asked, a little shocked. She had not dared to hope that she would stay in her beloved London, but to leave England altogether seemed terrifying to her. No, not quite, just short of it. I do believe the vast lands of Wintercrest come into contact with the country, but the manor itself is still on English soil. I see, Isabella said, trying to accustom herself to her new lot in life. I thank you again, Mr. Jenkins, for not only your work with my father, but for the help you have given me and your continued friendship. I will hurry home now and begin my preparations for travel. Isabella did just that. She did her best to pack a minimal amount of clothing into her chest and prepared anything she might want to keep safely tucked inside. Luckily, her maid, Sally, was there to help her with the work. All the time she wondered how she was going to manage on her own. Her last step was that of utter defiance. The night before she was set to leave, she took her small sewing kit and sewed her silver locket into the hem of her dress. She certainly couldn't be seen leaving the house wearing it, for Mr. Smith might come after her, demanding the property. That would be no way to start her new life. At the same time, she refused to leave it behind in the house that was once her home, for that wretched man to handle so roughly and sell like nothing more than a worthless trinket. She hoped that by the time Mr. Smith learned of her deceit, she would be far away and out of his reach. If there was one good thing about having to travel so far away from the city she loved, it was that she would also be far away from the man who sought to destroy her life at every turn. Her 3-day journey up north was not entirely uneventful. She was very uncomfortable having been placed inside a carriage with 5 other people. There was scarcely room to sit, let alone adjust one's position. She had to count herself lucky, though. After all, the fare was paid by her employer, and he had given her the kindness of a seat inside the carriage. There had been 2 who could only afford to sit on the roof of the carriage out in the elements. Many of those in the carriage were friendly enough and made small talk. As the days progressed, each got off in their turn till she was left alone with one other man. She noticed quite quickly that the scene outside her window changed from the warm sunshine of spring air to dark and gloomy clouds as she progressed northward. The final morning just before he took his leave, Isabella asked the portly gentleman across from her if grey weather was the norm in the north. "My dear Miss Watts," he said with a gruff moustache-filled voice, "I have lived here my whole life and can only boast of seeing full sunshine a handful of times each year. You are lucky that you have come for spring and summer first. It will help you acclimate before the harsh winter falls. I myself choose to stay in town for the dreary months, now that I am able, and only return for these warmer seasons." Isabella looked out her window again and contemplated how he could have possibly counted her view outside as a warmer season. She had decided to wear her simple light brown travelling dress. It was relatively without frill, which also meant it wouldn't show wrinkles as much in her travels. Though there was beautiful, lush green land as far as she could see, the sky had been nothing but grey. A hard, bitter wind bit back against the carriage, and, from time to time, it even drizzled down on them. Isabella had also learned from her companions on the ride that she would be staying just east of Northumberland along the coast. From the description of the estate, it sounded astonishing. Isabella supposed she would just have to get used to not only coastal fresh air and beautiful greenery, but also grey skies and damp weather. Finally, as dusk was beginning to settle on the third day, Isabella saw a long stone wall along the road. The driver had informed her earlier that this was the edge of Wintercrest Estates, and when they came to it, he knocked on the roof to silently point it out to her. Her excitement reached its limit as the driver slowed to a stop before the main gates. She got out and took a moment to stretch her limbs. The driver was already down and removing her trunk. Watching him struggle with it, she wondered if she had perhaps packed more than she should have. He set it down on the ground next to her at the gate and dusted his hands off, looking up at the expanse of the property. Isabella followed his gaze and admired it as well. Turning back to the driver, she was surprised to see him retaking his place on top of the carriage. "But wait," she called out. "Please, sir, what shall I do now?" "Can't say, Miss Watts. All I am to do is drop you right here." With a flip of his reins, he made his way onward, leaving Miss Isabella Watts utterly alone and confused at the threshold of Wintercrest Manor. Chapter 3. Isabella looked down the way leading to the manor house. She couldn't say for sure, however, since she could see nothing in the dimming light but the road before her. She tugged at her trunk, unable to lift it from its grassy resting place. She supposed that most people seeking employment here only brought the clothes on their back and another outfit for Sunday attire. If the 6 gowns she had foolishly packed weren't too much, then the books from her father's small library surely were. She had convinced herself that she could use these beloved stories as part of her pupils' education. Of course, the Duke of Wintercrest had enough of a library on his own that bringing books of her own was a silly, selfish move on her part. A cold wind whipped her, and she tightened the simple shawl she had wrapped around herself. Isabella suddenly wished that she had thought to bring a pelisse in her chest. Certainly they knew she would be arriving today. She waited a few moments, considering that the coachman who was to meet her was just a bit late. After a period of 10 minutes, she was convinced that at least a footman would eventually come to fetch her. Finally, as her ability to see in the cloudy, dim light was almost impossible, she determined that no one was coming and began to drag her trunk down the road. Had she been in the right frame of mind, she might have left her chest at the gate and walked on only to have it fetched at another time by someone more capable. She, however, was not in a good state of mind. She was shivering with cold and had no idea what she was to expect or have expected of her in her new lot in life. Luckily, the moon was full, and as clouds parted, she was able to get brief views of the way forward. When clouds obscured her only illumination, though, she did her best not to panic, as she could only see a few feet in front of her. Hopefully, the lights from the house would begin to show in a parting of the hedge trees that ran along the road. Finally, In a glimpse of momentary light from above, she saw a gentlemanly figure walking towards her up the road. He stopped upon also spotting her form. "Oh, thank heavens!" she called out, assuming him to be a servant sent to receive her. "I feared I was all forgotten about. Please, would you kindly help me with my portmanteau?" She straightened from her crouched, pulling position. The figure across from her, no more than 10 feet ahead, didn't seem to move. She couldn't make out his features in such dark lighting, but assumed that no one but a footman would be out at such a late hour. "Certainly," a sure, deep voice called back to her. The hurried figure met her and bent down to pick up her chest. "Pray, do tell me, though, why exactly are you dragging a chest down this road so late at night?" the man asked, as he began to walk forward easily with chest in hand. "Oh, forgive me. I thought you were the footman sent to retrieve me. I am Miss Isabella Watts. I have been employed as governess for His Grace. I do not mean to impose on you if your intention was not to come fetch me," she added quickly. "Well, I don't think I could leave you here to continue dragging such a large item," he said, shifting smoothly the weight in his hand. "I just assumed. You looked from a distance to be a footman by your stature, sir." She hesitated on her last word, pointing out that he had yet to give his own name. "Beg your pardon, Miss Watts. I am Captain Grant. I had just stepped outside for a walk in the fresh air. Sometimes things can get quite stifling inside." "Captain? Well, no wonder you have the stature of a footman," Isabella said, realizing it might be quite forward of her. "I just mean, my father was a sailor as well. I suppose I found kinship with your nautical air." "Was he also in the Royal Navy?" Captain Grant asked as they continued on their way. He seemed to know the direction by heart and walked at a steady pace through the now almost complete darkness. "No, he was on a merchant ship as a boy and had his own set of vessels later in life. He had quite a taste for the adventurous sea life," she added with a bit of nostalgia. "Pray, what was his name? Perhaps I met him on my journeys." Isabella was quite unsure of what name to give, his Christian name or his title. Certainly, to have a titled gentleman's daughter in the house might raise some animosity when it came to fitting in with other servants. Since Captain Grant was unquestionably a guest and not a member of the staff, Isabella risked the chance of giving her father's proper title, as he would have liked. "My father was Baron Leinster. He unfortunately passed a few months back." "I am so sorry to hear that." The gentleman looked down at her in the little light and held a tone of sincere sorrow. "My deepest condolences." Isabella thanked him for his kindness, and they walked on a few more minutes in silence. She pondered asking him about his service in the Royal Navy, hoping to make a good transition in the conversation, when she saw the lights of the manor up ahead. She gave a grateful sigh of relief. She had done her best to hide it, but her thin travelling dress and shawl had not been much to protect her from the wind that sliced between the hedge trees. She noticed immediately that her companion made his way to the head of the house. "Oh, if you please, Captain Grant, I would find it more appropriate for me to find my way to the servants' entrance. If you could just point me in the right direction, I would happily part company with you with my full thanks for your service." Captain Grant seemed to hesitate a minute. "I couldn't possibly leave you to take the portmanteau yourself," he finally said. "I am certain the household will find you a welcome guest." As much as Isabella would have liked to enter the vast manor in front as a guest, she knew that was no longer her station in life. It was time for her to divide the line from who she had been to who she was now. "I appreciate your kindness, but I am quite sure the housekeeper will expect me." "All right, then." Captain Grant seemed to resolve to her reasoning. "I shall escort you there. You are lucky you came upon me, for I know the servants' entrance well." "You do?" Isabella asked, surprised. "Yes," he replied with a soft chuckle. "I lived here in my youth, and as a young boy I was quite gangly and always in want of something to eat, usually sweets," he continued with that same flow of storytelling that Isabella had enjoyed so much from her father. She smiled and wondered if all seamen were expert folk-tellers. "I would often make my way through the kitchen by way of the service entrance to sneak a sweet cake from under the cook's nose. She, of course, knew exactly what I was doing and kindly turned a blind eye to it." She sounds like a very considerate chef. She is that, not to mention the best in all of the county. How fortunate His Grace must feel to have her here under his roof. They had finally arrived at the side entrance door, and moving the trunk to one hand, Captain Grant unceremoniously opened it and gestured for her to enter. Isabella was startled when she entered the room to find a well-lit hall with 3 long tables all filled with servants, no doubt eating their evening meal. They all stared at her in silent shock until the captain entered the room behind her. Instantly, the whole hall stood up. An older woman with a tight-fitted blonde bun and keys jingling at her waist came rushing forward. Isabella had no doubt that she was the housekeeper of the manor. "Lord Bellfourd, can I be of service to you, sir?" She was frantically looking between the new lady stranger and the Marquess of Bellfourd, son of the Duke of Wintercrest. "Mrs. Peterson, please let me introduce Miss Watts, our new governess. I was out on an evening stroll when I found her in some distress." Immediately, at Mrs. Peterson's request, a groomsman came forward and took the portmanteau away. He left the room with it. Isabella hoped to her own room. She, however, noticed that Mrs. Peterson had not addressed her or even looked at her directly. "I do apologise for your inconvenience, Lord Bellfourd. The governess was meant to arrive much earlier in the evening. Mr. Larson and I were just discussing sending out someone to inquire after her only a few moments ago." It was a little irritating to Isabella that she was being treated like a child and discussed without any acknowledgement of her presence. "I was left at the entrance, Mrs. Peterson, with no one to see me to the house," Isabella chimed in, tired of being ignored. Mrs. Peterson looked at her in shock, as if she had just noticed her for the first time. Finally, she turned back to the Marquess. "Thank you again, Lord Bellfourd. Is there anything else I can get for you before you return upstairs?" Isabella could see his countenance sink at the mention of his proper place above the servants' quarters. The situation was confusing enough on its own, but why had he given her a false name? Why hadn't he told her that he was the Duke of Wintercrest's son? She may not have been entirely well versed in all the peerage, but she had certainly done her research before leaving, and had learned that the Marquess of Bellfourd was the oldest son and heir to the Duke of Wintercrest. Lord Bellfourd turned to her and, giving a slight bow, began to bid her good night, probably something he should not have done. His eyes stopped at her feet, though, maybe coming to his senses, she thought, and looked up at her questioningly. "Miss Watts, there seems to be something coming out of the hem of your gown." Isabella looked down in fear to see the chain of her locket sticking out and dragging along the ground. "Oh dear," Isabella said, crimson with shame. She pushed her skirt with her folded hands in front of her, as if the act would hide the charm dangling below. It was bad enough that she had obviously made a fool of herself, calling the Marquess a footman. But now she had the added shame of showing the jewellery she had sewn into her dress for safekeeping. No doubt, in the short time they had been together, he had surmised she was not only naive and rude, but also very odd. "It is very dear to me, and I feared to lose it in travelling," she stammered, most embarrassed. Much to her horror, and the horror of everyone in the room, Lord Bellfourd bent down and removed the last of the chain from her hem. He stood and held it out for her to take. Without looking him in the eye for fear of crying, she let the chain fall into her gloved hand. "Thank you, Lord Bellfourd," she said softly, with the most profound curtsy she could manage. "I will bid you good night, then," Lord Bellfourd responded, not wanting to make the young Miss Watts any more embarrassed. "Good evening, Mrs. Peterson." The whole room waited till he was out of the hall, before resuming their seats and whispering amongst themselves. Isabella finally met the gaze of the housekeeper, who seemed to be measuring her once the room went back to hushed speaking and clanking of dishes. Without so much as a word, she turned on her heels, pausing only once to beckon, in an irritated fashion, for Isabella to follow. Utterly put in her place, Isabella did her best not to look at the side glances around her as she followed Mrs. Peterson out of the servant dining hall. Chapter 4. Isabella listened silently to her hastened tour from Mrs. Peterson, the weight of her locket heavy in her hand. Mrs. Peterson insisted that the trip must not be a quick one. since she had arrived much later than expected. She cared not for the fact that Isabella had been left on the side of the road, with no help getting to the manor. You will be situated in the west wing of the manor in the extra servants' quarters in the attic. Your students' room, nursery, and schoolroom are also located on that side of the manor. There is no reason for you to venture outside that wing without permission. Is that clear? Yes, of course, Isabella responded, now leaving the lower levels of the servants' quarters and up to the main floor. Not stopping on the main floor, Mrs. Peterson immediately turned and went up the second set of stairs, then a third, and finally, a fourth. By the fourth set of stairs, the ascension was steep and narrow. The final floor was, no doubt, the attic space used for overflow staffing. The ceiling was scarcely tall enough not to rub against Mrs. Peterson's high bun. She walked 2 doors over and bade Isabella enter. The room was unquestionably smaller than the one she had at home, but not at all displeasing to look at. The footman had kindly deposited her trunk at the end of a small but comfortable-looking bed. It was dressed in a simple quilt, decorated with embroidered flowers. The footman had also been kind enough to light a fire in the small fireplace that was to the right of the bed. To the left of it was a little, round port window in the pointed arch of a spire. In front, there was a small table and one plush but ragged-looking chair. No doubt it had been moved up when no longer suitable for the main house. Aside from that, the only other furniture was a small table for basin and water pitcher, and a petite cabinet closet. Though none of the furniture matched and the walls were only a pure whitewash, the room was warmed by the fire and cosy. Isabella was grateful to see the space she could call her own after the long trip with such close quarters. Mrs. Peterson waited, arms folded in front, while Isabella inspected the room. When Isabella turned back to her, she didn't have a moment to speak before Mrs. Peterson began. Your breakfast and basin of water will be brought to you every morning. You will eat your breakfast here. Luncheon and tea will be served with Miss Jacqueline and her nurse, and dinner will be brought up to you here promptly at 9 o'clock. Won't I be taking my meals downstairs? Isabella asked, a little surprised that she would be expected to hole up in her room any time she was not with her student. Of course not. You are not one of the staff. You are the governess. Your meals will be taken here, where it is good and proper. It was easy to see that Mrs. Peterson found propriety very important. I was told that your father was Baron Leinster, she continued. Isabella was slightly disappointed that her upbringing was already well known. Yes, was her simple reply. Well, I am sure you understand that things are different now. You are not a guest of His Grace, but a paid worker. You are expected to do your job to the best of your abilities. You will not have a lady's maid. I trust you expected this and can take care of yourself. It was more of a statement than a question. Of course, I would never have presumed otherwise. Very well, then. As I said, warm water and your breakfast tray will be brought to you in the morning at 7 and 7:30 respectively. I will come and get you at 7:45 to meet Miss Jacqueline. At 10, you will be presented to His Grace and introductions to the rest of the family will follow, as he dictates. He will tell you what duties are expected of you while you stay.
Before we continue into the story, do us a favor. Like this video and hit the subscribe button because it helps very much with YouTube's algorithm. If you want the audiobooks ads free, visit our website and select our bundles to save more. Thank you again. Now back to our story.
It wasn't hard to miss that Mrs. Peterson was not pleased that Isabella had already acquainted Lord Bellfourd before the designated time. You have from 3 o'clock onwards to yourself, as the nurse will take her duties then. You may explore the grounds outside, as long as you are not infringing on the family. You are expected to accompany Miss Jacqueline to church with the family every Sunday morning, and then you are free to use the afternoon as you wish. Many of the servants use the opportunity to go into town, which is about a mile's walk. All other expectations will be given to you by His Grace in the morning. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, Isabella said, now feeling very exhausted from her journey. Could you also please tell me how I might post mail? She seemed to think this over for a minute, undoubtedly weighing what was proper for such a situation. Of course, mailing post along with the members of the household would not be acceptable. She wasn't quite sure whether leaving it in the servants' hall, as the other staff members did, was quite right for her either. Finally, though, it was what she settled on. There is a basket on a small table next to the service entrance. Letters may be left there to be posted. She bid Isabella a crisp good night and left the room. Isabella sat for a few moments on her bed, taking it all in, before finally opening her still gloved hand and replacing the locket around her neck. Feeling like herself again with her treasured locket adorning her neck, she set about unpacking her belongings. It took some effort to get all her gowns into the small cabinet, and she realised again how ridiculous she must have seemed to the Marquess, forcing him to lug so many belongings. For lack of a better place, she lined up her treasured novels along the wall between the cabinet and the metal headboard of the bed. With most of her last possessions in their places, Isabella managed to get herself undressed, only the third time she had done so on her own, and slipped beneath the soft cover of her bed. She was grateful for a room with a fireplace. She stared dreamily into its dwindling embers, as she wondered if that was why she had been placed in a room so far away from the other staff. Had it been for the extra comfort of the fire, or was it for the access to her pupil's side without interfering with others in the house? Or simply to give her a physical reminder that she was neither one of the lords and ladies who lived in such a lavish manner, nor one of the staff that served them? Her last thought as she fell asleep was if this had been how her father felt when out to sea. Adrift, with land in front and land behind, and nothing but a lone ship to carry him. Would she spend the rest of her days lost out at sea as a solitary island, or could she find a way to make it to shore, no matter the one she chose? The next morning, Isabella woke early to the darkened grey sky greeting her through the small porthole window. She was surprised how well she had slept, no doubt due to exhaustion from the long journey. She was afraid that she might have overslept, as she was not used to waking up early. She got up hastily and quickly tiptoed over to the small clock that alone adorned the fireplace mantel. She poked at the fire, finding a few coals warm beneath the ash, and did her best to use the fuel provided to get it going again. Once there was a small flicker of flame, Isabella turned, hearing a slight knock at her door. She opened it to find a maid standing with a pitcher of steaming water and basin. She stood aside to let the girl in to set it down on the small stand next to her bed. "Thank you. That looks lovely, miss." Isabella trailed off, waiting for the girl to introduce herself. She was very young, not more than 16. "Just Betsy, Miss Watts," she said with a thick Scottish accent and a curtsy. "Are you Scottish, then?" Isabella asked. "Aye. Most of the lower staff is Miss Watts." "Please call me Isabella," she encouraged. "Shall I bring my basin down when I am done?" "Oh, no, miss. I mean Isabella. I shall come and fetch it up when I bring your breakfast tray." "That is very kind of you. I am sure it is tedious work to go up and down so many stairs." "Dinna fash, I dinna mind it one bit. It's a much more enjoyable task than the others." Betsy turned to leave after another short curtsy, but paused just a moment. "I dinna mean to be a bother, but I was a-wondering if you happen to need help with your things, dressing and hair, I mean to say." "I would be happy to help you." "That is very considerate of you, Betsy, but I would hate to ask more of you than you already do, or give you additional tasks. It may take some practice, but I believe I will soon learn to do it on my own." "You see, you would be doing me a favour if you let me," Betsy continued. "I want to be a lady's maid one day for a fine house, mayhaps even this one. I need the practice first, you see. I heard that you were raised as a lady, so I thought you might help me. Tell me if I was doing something wrong and the like. Well, I suppose I could use some help to make something simple with my hair." "Aye, that would be great practice for me, if ye would allow it." "Mrs. Peterson won't be mad. I had the feeling she didn't want me speaking with others very much." "It's not like that. She is just vera particular that all are in their place and none try to be more than they are. It makes it pretty impossible for a lass like me to make much more of herself. But what she dinna ken won't hurt her much." "Well, if you are sure we won't be caught," Isabella hesitated. "I suppose it would be fine. I would love to do what I can to help you. Isabella meant it sincerely, too. It was the first friend she had made in the house, and any way she could help Betsy, she was willing to. It reminded her of something her father used to say. A small act of kindness can open the door for great friendships. Isabella used the warm water to wash and freshen herself before dressing. She found a soft green-coloured cotton morning dress that she paired with a dark velvet green Spencer jacket. Though the dress was very modest in cut, she still fretted over its look as a practical dress. She was, after all, hoping to put the right foot forward with his grace, after clearly blundering things with the Marquess the night before. She smartly tucked a fichu into the top of her green gown, before putting on the Spencer jacket. Though she had the fire going relatively well, she feared she would never get used to the chill that always seemed present in this northern country. Tucking a cream handkerchief into her long sleeve, she finished just in time for Betsy to knock at the door again. She came in and set the tray down on the small table beside the port window. Before eating, Isabella sat in the only chair facing the window, while Betsy pulled her hair back into a tight chignon. She left a few of Isabella's dark ringlets out to frame her face. Isabella did her best to feel around to assure Betsy she had done a fantastic job, as there was no mirror present in the room. Seeming happy to have gotten some practice in, Betsy thanked her again, then took the water basin and left Isabella to eat her breakfast alone. She had just finished her toast and rejuvenating cup of tea when a knock came to her door again. This time, it was Mrs. Peterson, and she was very accurate with her timing. Without so much as a good morning, she turned on her heels, expecting Isabella to follow after. Isabella supposed that this was a common habit of Mrs. Peterson. Not only did she feel everyone had their place to be, but also the use of words that didn't need to be spoken was a waste of time. She quickly walked to catch up to Mrs. Peterson for the second time in 2 days to start her new beginning as governess. Chapter 5. Isabella made her way down the narrow stairway and ended on the second floor of the main house. She followed Mrs. Peterson along the Turkish rugged hall, listening to the soft pads of their feet on the ground and swishing of skirts. She was surprised that, for such a large house, filled with not only the family of the house but at least 100 servants downstairs, and not all the tables were even full, it was so quiet. Where was everyone else? She had expected to see maids bustling around and hear the clank of breakfast silverware in the distance, but it was complete and utter silence as she walked. Perhaps it was just that the west wing of the manor was far off from the rest of the house, she thought. The wing was basically a rectangle shape with a walkway that outlined the rectangle. Off the walkway, numerous doors sprouted along the walls. The middle, however, was open, with 4 enormous chandeliers hanging down from the ceiling. Isabella took a second to look over the railing on their walk and saw the most magnificent ballroom she had ever set her eyes on. It took up the whole of the bottom floor. The chandeliers, as well as at least a dozen standing candelabras dotting along the floor, were all covered with sheets, as was a section in the far corner that was no doubt used for a live orchestra. She imagined royalty might very well dance in that hall on occasion. As she walked, she learned that her quarters were the farthest west and left edge of the manor, her small port window looking out at the left side of the property. She had gotten so mixed up walking the downstairs corridors that she hadn't realised which way she was facing. She remembered seeing the front of the manor in the dark and pictured mentally the 3 sections. Her left side held the grand hall and a significant amount of what she assumed were guest rooms above it. The middle section was no doubt the main part of the house with studies, libraries, sitting and drawing rooms. Most likely, in a house this size, it also boasted a smaller hall for more intimate affairs and the various dining rooms. Then, lastly, she pictured in her mind the east wing of the manor. She wondered if it shared a similar large hall and rooms that housed the family, or if it was completely different from the beauty she was walking along. Finally, they made their way from the bottom of the attic stairs along the straight walk to the other end of the wing. Here there was a small half-circle alcove that led to 2 rooms on either side of the end of the rectangle and a grand staircase that led down to the lower floor of the central portion. It was a sensational foyer, with painted ceiling squares, another large chandelier, and marble floors. Isabella stopped for a moment to look at the grandeur of it all. She saw the large double doors that led from the outside into the foyer, as well as an exquisite matching staircase opposite her. She did see a single maid dusting one of the vases that adorned the great room, along with several marble statues. It was unimaginable to Isabella that this house was lived in. It looked like a royal estate, more magnificent than any she had ever seen. "Miss Watts, if you please," Mrs. Peterson said with impatience. She motioned to a third door from the small half-circle alcove. No doubt these rooms, closest to the main house, were meant for children. They were far enough away as not to be a bother to the lords and ladies that graced the house, but close enough to come when needed. Isabella smiled at the thought of how many little eyes had spied over the walkway banister to lavish balls below. Mrs. Peterson opened the door without knocking, and Isabella followed in after her. She found herself in a large room with a small library of its own on either side of a crackling fireplace. There were comfortable chairs seated near the fire, no doubt for reading. There was a long wall facing outside to the back of the estate. Lush curtains in velvet green draped between the windows that showed vast manicured gardens and even a large pond. Next to the windows were a small table and 4 chairs, probably for lunch. And all the way to the right side of the room was a child-sized table where one timid little girl was sitting quietly with her hands folded on top. Next to the girl stood a woman just past middle age. She was wearing the cream-coloured dress and apron of a nurse, as well as a bonnet with large ruffles framing her kind-looking face. She motioned for her charge to stand at the women's entrance, and the little girl did as she was told. "Mrs. Murray," Mrs. Peterson started, "I am pleased to introduce you to Miss Watts, our new governess. She will be relieving you of your duties during the day." "Ach, they are not much of duties with this little angel," Mrs. Murray said in a thick Scottish accent. The little girl smiled up at her nurse with affection. It was clear she didn't understand much of what she said. She was a young girl and seemed small for her age, very petite and thin. She had golden blonde ringlet hair and still had the round face of a small child. She looked shyly at the newcomer. "Miss Jacqueline de Belmont," Mrs. Peterson said a little louder than before. "This is your governess, Miss Watts." Mrs. Peterson, ever the proper lady, made the formal introduction to the child. Isabella laughed a little to herself. The child spoke a different language. She wasn't hard of hearing. Isabella stood before the young girl, then knelt down to Jacqueline's level. "Enchantée. Je m'appelle Mademoiselle Watts." Jacqueline's little face lit up. "Parlez-vous français?" "Oui," Isabella answered with a small smile. This poor little girl had probably felt so alone and isolated in this house. Indeed, she was well loved by her nurse, but Isabella couldn't imagine leaving one's home and being surrounded by a new culture and language. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat. Though all members of His Grace's family are fluent in French, the Duke would prefer if the child learns English. "Of course," Isabella said, standing back up. The young girl slipped her hand into Isabella's, and Isabella smiled down at her, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "If you please, I would like to meet with my pupil and see what she has already learned." "Of course," Mrs. Peterson said, already leaning towards leaving the room. Surely she had much more pressing matters at this time. "I will return to escort you to His Grace." Isabella nodded in understanding and waited for Mrs. Peterson to leave. She turned to Mrs. Murray, who hadn't gone yet. "Mrs. Murray, if you have a moment before you go, would you please share with me how you and Miss Jacqueline have been spending your day?" "I dinna mind at all. Miss Jacqueline is a very sweet child. Sadly, she doesn't know much to say. She does enjoy playing with her dolls. We go on walks after luncheon to enjoy some fresh air. I expect His Grace will desire her time in nature to continue. That would be fine. It would give us some time to explore natural science. I understand that Mrs. Peterson wants Jacqueline to focus on learning English, but I hope you will allow me to discuss what she knows thus far from her previous education. To do so, we would need to speak in French. Ugh, don't you worry about that. Mrs. Peterson is a stickler for the rules. What she dinna ken won't hurt her. I will sit right here, she said, as she took a spot in a chair by the fire. I've been working on some winter mittens for the wee lass. I'll be able to hear when Mrs. Peterson comes up the hall and give you warning. Thank you, Mrs. Murray. Isabella looked down into the little hand still clasped in hers. Shall we find some dolls to play with then? She asked in French. Jacqueline's small eyes lit up. Tugging on Isabella's hand, she took her past the table and through a door that led into a nursery. She collected some dolls and brought them before the fire at her nurse's feet, something she had apparently done on a regular basis. Isabella followed along and took her place next to the child on the floor. While they played, they discussed where Jacqueline grew up and what she liked to do. She was just 5 years old when her mother told her that she would be leaving France and spending time with her grandparents. She spoke lovingly of her mother, but from what she said, her mother seemed to be of a certain profession. Grandparents? Isabella asked. Oh, aye. Jacqueline is the daughter of the late Marquess of Bellfourd, Mrs. Murray said, not looking up from her work. Lord James, God rest him, was an honourable man. I ken him since he was a young boy of 12. He could be a bit free-spirited, but not any more so than others of his upbringing. 2 years ago, he came home from a hunting expedition that had taken a turn in the weather. He never recovered from it, she finished softly. Papa? Jacqueline asked softly of Mrs. Murray, only understanding a few words of what her nurse said. She nodded to the girl. Your papa was a very good man, lass. No kinder heart could be found. You see, she said, turning back to Isabella, about a year after his passing, His Grace received a letter from a Madame de Belmont of Paris. She claimed that Lord James had fathered a child by her and had been giving her a living. She asked that the child continue to be provided for, as she struggled to do so on her own. His Grace agreed under the condition that she be brought here and raised as a proper young lady. What a kindness, considering her... Isabella didn't want to say with the child present, whether she understood the words or not. I suspect that after the heartache of loss, you see, His Grace was very close to his eldest son. He was hoping for a chance to have a bit of him back. And certainly, he feels blessed to have her here, Isabella said, looking down at Jacqueline, who was softly singing a French lullaby to her doll. Many of us do, Mrs. Murray said without explanation. It left Isabella wondering who wouldn't be happy to have such a polite little girl in the household. She supposed that her parentage might cause some discomfort. She would never be considered a lady of the peerage, but growing in the Duke's house and having an exceptional education, she would be a fine lady some day. Isabella spent the remainder of the morning playing with the child, asking her questions here and there to see what amount of instruction she had thus far. She didn't expect much at the tender age of 6, but was surprised that the girl's mother had spent every night reading to her from quite beautiful books. She felt a pang of sorrow for this little girl, who too had lost her mother, even if just by the separation of land. She couldn't imagine having such happy memories with her own mother and then being forced to leave her. Have you written to your mother since coming here? Isabella asked her in perfect French. Yes. Aunt Abigail is kind to me. She writes letters for me and reads back what my mother sends me. Isabella was happy to hear that she was able to keep correspondence with her mother at least. Soon I can show you how to write your own letters and words, and then you may write to your mother, all on your own. Of course, Isabella knew writing fluent letters, even in French, was a way off for a girl of 6, but it was at least the start of a goal they could make for her education. Miss Watts, I believe I hear footsteps. I suspect it is Mrs. Peterson coming for you. It is mid-morning, and I am sure His Grace is ready for you now. Isabella stood and made sure her skirt was in proper order. Jacqueline came to hug her waist before she left. Already, in just a few short hours, this child was endeared to her. Isabella was out the door just as Mrs. Peterson reached the top of the stairs, much to her surprise. Without many words, however, she merely turned around, expecting Isabella to follow. Isabella shook her head with a soft laugh. She wasn't sure if she would ever understand the complexity of Mrs. Peterson. Chapter 6. They made their way down the stairs and along the marble hall through to the back end of the central part of the house. Isabella did her best not to look so shocked by the extravagance of everything around her. Some large oak doors were closed, others open, showing a breakfast room, a vast library, and a morning sitting room. Isabella couldn't help but wonder what was behind the other doors, if she could only explore the winding corridors. They stopped at a closed door just to the right of the library. Mrs. Peterson knocked, and when bid to enter, she opened both doors. It was a massive office with its own grand fireplace burning warmly along the longest wall. Next to the hearth was a door that Isabella was sure was connected to the library. Why His Grace would need access to that library when he had 3 walls covered in books here in this room, Isabella didn't know. The room itself was covered in a dark navy wallpaper with gold trimming. All along the walls, where books weren't found, were various paintings of the previous owners of this office. Isabella wondered why every room she had seen thus far in the main house was draped in such a dark manner. Surely, with the gloomy weather outside, bright, vibrant colours would help to warm the large estate. She had to remind herself again that she was no longer a lady and that she didn't need to waste her time wondering about things she had no business thinking of. Her sole purpose now was education, and that was what needed to occupy her thoughts. She stood in front of the desk and waited for the elderly man, bent in work, to notice them. When he set his writing down and looked to her, she followed Mrs. Peterson's lead and gave a polite curtsy. "Your Grace, I present to you the new governess, Miss Isabella Watts." Isabella did her best to ignore the gentleman who was directly behind the Duke and had apparently been discussing whatever work His Grace was doing before the women entered. One quick flash of a look at the Marquess of Bellfourd showed a broad, bright smile as he presently looked back at her. It was infuriating to Isabella. This man had made a fool of her only the night before in front of the whole household of servants, and here he stood smugly about it. He probably had even shared his story with his father, the ridiculous governess who treated her employer's son like a footman. The Duke removed the pair of wired spectacles he had been wearing and inspected Isabella up and down. "I was informed you had an extensive education, that you would be quite capable of teaching a pupil, though you have no references or experience." Isabella caught a questioning look from Lord Bellfourd. He must not have been informed that she was without experience. The Duke looked to be getting on in years and health, and Lord Bellfourd was, of course, here to help him in preparation for his own turn as manager of the estate. Would she be out of a job upon this occurrence? "No experience. Are you sure this is the best we can do for little Jackie?" Lord Bellfourd asked his father, right in front of her. "I studied at Mrs. Mason's school for exceptional young ladies. I enjoyed my studies and kept them in practice over the years," Isabella stated, jutting her chin out just a little. "The child is lucky to have a governess at all. I did as you and Abigail requested and hired a lady from London. I do not doubt that her qualifications will be suitable for the child's situation. Also, you are well aware that I do not like it when you call her by that name." Isabella didn't like standing there and being spoken of in front of her for the second time in 2 days. It also didn't escape her attention that Lord Bellfourd had been the one concerned for Jacqueline, and the Duke himself had refused even to speak her name. She wondered if this was what Mrs. Murray had alluded to. Certainly it was the Duke who had allowed the child to come to his home. Was he unhappy with her presence now that she was here? Isabella couldn't imagine how such a sweet young thing could upset him, though. Perhaps the memory of the lost son, though desired at first, had turned into a constant, painful reminder. Isabella understood well the feeling of loss and the complicated emotions it brought out. Turning back to Isabella, "I am sure you will be well suited, Miss Watts. I do, however, have a few conditions before you proceed in regards to how I want her educated." "Of course, Your Grace. I will be happy to meet any requirements you see fit." "Good. Foremost, I want her to start learning English right away. I am aware that you are fluent in French. Yes, Your Grace. Please use your talents to transition her to the language of her new home. I don't want any more encouragement of her native tongue now that you are here to teach her otherwise properly. Isabella could see that last comment was meant for the Marquess and not herself. Of course, Father, Lord Bellfourd said with slight irritation. Perhaps, Isabella chimed in, seeing that this was a subject at odds between her current employer and potential future one. It might be beneficial for her to keep the native language. Of course, I will do as you wish, Your Grace, and begin immediately to develop her English, but we could also have a short time each day for her to have a French lesson. Having a second language is an important tool for any young lady, and it could bring her comfort to be able to write to her mother in such a way. Isabella heard Mrs. Peterson clear her throat behind her, obviously not happy that Isabella had suggested something that had just been contradicted by the Duke. I rather think that would be a fine compromise, Father, Lord Belford chimed in. Well, the Duke faltered a bit. I suppose it will be fine if she only speaks it during specific lessons for the language. Of course, Your Grace. Now, other requirements for the child. She is to spend a portion of her day outside for lessons and exercise, and twice a week you will present her to me, so that I may assess her progress. Of course, Your Grace, Isabella repeated. She could see the Duke's spectacles were being put back on, and guessed that meant that was the end of the discussion. I already have a vast library of resources for the child in the schoolroom, but should you need any others, you are welcome to the library just over that way. He waved to the door. You, yourself, may borrow any book you wish from the collection, as long as you sign the servant roster found within. How very kind of you, Your Grace. I suspect you have reading material sufficient for your needs at the moment, judging by the weight of your case. Lord Bellfourd chimed in with a knowing smile. Isabella's eyes hit the floor as she flushed red. She heard an indignant puff from behind her. What are you talking about, Christian? The Duke said, lowering his spectacles to look up at his son. Nothing, Father, he said with a jolly smile. Isabella was irritatingly embarrassed, but also relieved that Lord Bellfourd had chosen not to share the events of the night before with the Duke. Mrs. Peterson, I am sure you are quite busy with household business. I will be happy to escort Miss Watts back to the schoolroom, as I have not yet seen my niece today. Mrs. Peterson hesitated. Of course, she would not argue with the request to leave, but she also questioned allowing such a thing to happen. With no apparent objection from the Duke, who was back at his work, she made one last curtsy and left. Lord Bellfourd gave his father a hand on the shoulder, and the Duke waved him off without looking up from his work. Coming across the room, Lord Bellfourd motioned for Isabella to go on ahead of him. She waited till they were out of the office and well past the doorway before speaking. I don't think I ever got a chance to apologise for my mistake last night, she finally said, not looking at him. There is nothing to apologise for. I am just glad I was there to help. I can't imagine dragging such a heavy load all the way from the main road. Isabella looked up at him to see if he was teasing her again. She took a moment to study him. He was much taller than most men she knew and broad of shoulder. He had thick strawberry blonde hair that was tied back with a simple ribbon. His eyes, which looked down at her with a joking glint, were of the most transparent blue. They reminded her much of the little girl she had just spent the morning with, though everything else about his features was much different. In a way, he resembled a much younger version of the Duke, with a square jaw and long pointed nose. She decided that he couldn't be more than 26 years old. She had noticed that not only did the Duke share the strawberry red hair, though the Duke's was mostly grey, but many of the portraits on the wall in the office did too. I'm glad to see your charm made the trip safely, he added with a wicked grin, and motioned with his eyes to the locket around her neck. Isabella quickly clasped her hand over it, hiding it from him. She heard the rumble of a chuckle from inside his chest, and she could bear the embarrassment no longer. I changed my mind. I don't apologise for the mistake. In fact, one might say the situation was all of your making, since you gave me a false name and all. Lord Bellfourd stopped at the bottom of the steps leading up to the west wing and gave a hearty laugh at her moment of rage. It was a fantastic deep sound, something she could tell his lordship used often. "My dear Miss Watts," he finally said, regaining his composure, "I am so sorry I have upset you. Forgive me. I am told by my sister I do tend to be a teaser. I meant nothing by it. Though I must inform you that I didn't lie to you. My name is Captain Christian Grant, formerly of the Royal Navy. It has just been a little over a year that I have been anything besides this." Isabella thought this over in her head. It made sense, of course. He was the second son of a duke, so an employment in the Royal Navy was undoubtedly fitting. Upon his brother's untimely death, he was most likely called back home to take his place. "Oh well," Isabella stammered, feeling her brazen attitude may have gotten her in trouble again. "Don't concern yourself, Miss Watts. How could you have known?" he said reassuringly. "Perhaps, though, you could gratify my curiosity and tell me what exactly you had in that trunk of yours and why that simple locket is so important to you." "Well, you were right on the first part. I brought with me some of my favourite books, not realising I would be allowed to borrow others. And the locket," she said, smoothing the silver she still held in her hand as they made their way upstairs. "It was my mother's. My father gave it to me for my 16th birthday with the lock of hair she gave him the first time he went out to sea. I can see now why that might be so cherished. Yes, she passed in childbirth, so it gives me a sort of closeness to her." "It seems your life has been full of hardships," he said back. "Not more than others," Isabella said, as she scrunched her nose in thought. "I imagine many have much more heartache than myself. Life seems to be equally unfair to all in one way or another." "Well said," he agreed. They had made their way up the stairs, and without ceremony, Lord Belford entered the schoolroom. "Uncle Christian!" Jacqueline squealed with delight as she hopped up and wrapped her arms around him. She began spilling out the morning's events in quick French to her beloved uncle. It was clear to Isabella that he was beloved by this little child. Though his teasing had put her off a bit, she couldn't help but enjoy his company as she watched him interact with his little niece, more like a child than the future Duke of Wintercrest. Chapter 7. My dearest Louisa, I hope that this letter finds you well. I have missed you and your pleasing companionship since leaving London. I have now settled into my new station here at Wintercrest Manor. I have never seen something so spectacular as this house. The gardens, too, are vast and intriguing. The house is so large that I have been here almost a week and have only seen a portion of the servants and half of the household. It is hard for me to imagine a child growing up in such a large and looming house. My pupil is a beautiful little child. I told you in my last letter of her upbringing and what resulted in her residing here. She is such a kind and sweet little girl. We spend each afternoon walking the grounds, per the Duke of Wintercrest's request. This is a cherished time for both Jacqueline and myself. It is clear to me now that she was raised deep in the city of Paris and never spent much time even in parks. Every new side garden we take or walk along a wooden path is a glorious adventure for her. I, too, have grown to love our afternoon walks. Though the air is almost always chilled, even as spring approaches, I have thoroughly enjoyed the open beauty that this country has provided me. I told you before of my disastrous first meeting with Lord Bellfourd. I had hoped, after that first day, I would not see him much at all. Unquestionably, he is very busy helping his father with the estate and learning all that comes with it. Much to my surprise, he finds a moment almost every day to spend with little Jacqueline. Often he sits and listens as she tells him of the adventures she has had or stories she has learned that day. One day, in fact, he insisted that Mrs. Murray and I make ready and send Jacqueline and her afternoon tea down to him in one of the sitting rooms. He treated her like a proper lady coming to attend him for afternoon tea. Jacqueline could barely contain herself when she came back to us. She genuinely felt like a princess that day. Despite his early teasing, I have found Lord Belfourd to be a kind man who loves to dote on his little niece. I can't help but hold a high regard in my mind for someone who could be so incredible to a small girl, who has already overcome so much in her young age. I have learned from Mrs. Murray today that the youngest member of the household, Lady Abigail, will be returning home today from a visit to her relatives. I will have the opportunity to meet both her and her mother this evening, as I have been informed that I will be presenting Jacqueline for her first inspection to the Duke after their evening meal. I am not sure what worries me more, meeting such fine ladies of such a lavished house, or presenting Jacqueline before her grandfather. We have spent the better part of today's lesson practicing her introductions in perfect English, and have also taught her counting from 1 to 10. I feel this is a great feat for such a young child who up until last week knew almost no English at all. It is clear that her uncle's lavish attentions also prevented her from picking up the new language, as he has only spoken to her in French, as far as I have seen. This is in spite of the Duke's evident dislike of it. I confess that I am happy that this child's transition over the year had been all the less traumatic with the familiar words of her homeland. I hope that you are doing well and receiving my letters. I am quite aware that this is the second I have sent in a week's time. I am so very used to talking to you every day, even passing our notes when we do not see each other. I suppose I will have to get used to the long travel each letter must take to reach you, my dear. It is an excellent opportunity for me to exercise patience, something you, of course, know I am not altogether good at. Your friend, Isabella. Chapter 8. Isabella was pacing her room, occasionally stopping to recheck the clock. She was to pick up Jacqueline and take her down to the Duke and the rest of the family precisely at 8 o'clock to be inspected. As this was her first time ever doing this, she had no idea what to expect. She, of course, knew that Mrs. Murray, who had to take charge of the child that afternoon as she always did, would take special care to make sure Jacqueline looked her very best. What scared her even more was the prospect of meeting the Duchess for the first time tonight. Of course, the Duke had been the one to hire her, but if she didn't find favour in the Duchess's eyes, then assuredly the employment would be terminated. What was Isabella to do then? She certainly would never go back to Mr. Smith to beg for his mercy. She touched the locket around her neck. How had he reacted when he found it missing? She hoped he had left it alone. After all, it wasn't really worth much, but at the same time, she knew it wasn't about the money or her father's debt. All Mr. Smith wanted to do was make Isabella's life miserable as a punishment for turning him down all those years ago. The clock chimed the quarter hour, and Isabella stopped her pacing. She straightened her skirts one last time. She had racked her brain over how to dress. Should she wear the one velvet green dinner gown she had left, or continue to wear her more plain and simple cotton dress she had worn during the day? She had no idea what would be more proper in this situation. She had finally decided on the dinner gown. It was at least dark in colour, such a deep forest green that, in the evening light of candles, it could take on a hue of black. It seemed most fitting for a governess. Isabella made her way down the long walkway toward her pupil's nursery, where she was to pick her up from Mrs. Murray. She entered the room with a soft knock to find Jacqueline sitting on the floor playing dolls with another young lady. Mrs. Murray was sitting in the corner rocker, knitting another pair of gloves. The lady stood upon Isabella's entrance, and she knew that this must be Lady Abigail. She was a young girl of no more than 17. She was wearing a beautiful soft blue silk dinner dress with white pearls decorating the bodice. She shared her brother's same crystal blue eyes, but her hair was a rich red, almost startlingly so. "I beg your pardon, Lady Abigail," Isabella said with a curtsy. "I was asked to take Jacqueline to his grace." "Why, you must be Miss Watts, then," Lady Abigail said with a sweet smile. "For a second, I was worried you were that horrid Mrs. Peterson coming in. She shan't have liked to see me sitting on the floor playing dollies. She is quite a strict one, isn't she?" Lady Abigail asked, like she was talking to a friend. Isabella was uncertain how to respond. Naturally, she would not share her personal opinions of Mrs. Peterson to a lady of the house. It would have been most forward of Isabella. Mrs. Peterson does seem very devoted to her duties. She seems to have a good feel for such a large estate, was all that Isabella could come up with. She hasn't been here with us long, you know. Lady Abigail continued, as if she was speaking to a close confidant. Only the last year, just before we got our sweet Jackie here. I suppose Father was hoping to find someone who would tighten the reins on us children a little more. Mrs. Murray cleared her throat from the corner. Abigail smiled at the action. Nurse Murray, on the other hand, has been here so long she took care of not just myself but my brother Christian as well. I believe she thinks I am too much of a gossip. It is a bad habit of mine, I must admit. I apologise, Nursey, Lady Abigail said affectionately while turning. You didn't need to apologise, Lady Abigail. Perhaps you best be off, though, so as not to keep your father waiting, Nursey. Jacqueline giggled under her breath at Lady Abigail's nickname for her nurse. Well, you see, I was very little when Mrs. Murray came, and it was just easier for me to say, Lady Abigail told the child in French. Jacqueline turned to Mrs. Murray and slowly asked in the best English she could muster, I call you Nursey, Que puis-je vous appeler? What can I call you? Isabella's heart swelled at the question, as she watched Mrs. Murray connect with the little girl. With tears glistening in her eyes, Mrs. Murray reached her arms out. Yes, she whispered. You can call me Nursey. Jacqueline went to her quickly and they shared an embrace. Mrs. Murray nuzzled the crook of Jacqueline's neck, and her eyes lifted to meet Isabella's. I expect that would be quite lovely, Mrs. Murray said after getting control of her emotion. Now, off you go, my little lass, while your curls are still bouncing. Of course, Jacqueline's perfectly curled blonde hair was always in immaculate ringlets, but Mrs. Murray fluffed them all the same before returning the girl to her waiting aunt. Jacqueline slipped one hand into Lady Abigail's and then reached out to Isabella with the other. It was one of the things about Jacqueline that Isabella enjoyed so much, her pure, innocent spirit. Of course, Isabella should follow behind the two girls as just an employee, but both Lady Abigail and Jacqueline stood ready. So, with a girlish giggle of her own, Isabella took Jacqueline's hand. The three of them happily marched down the broad stairway leading to the main house. It wasn't until they got to the hallway leading into the large drawing room that the fun giggling stopped. Mrs. Peterson was in that hall. It was as if someone had opened a window and let a cold gust in. Lady Abigail took the lead with little Jacqueline in hand, while Isabella slipped back, just behind them. In this way, they entered the drawing room. Isabella found the rest of the family already seated. The Duke sat in the large high-back chair closest to the fire, with a blanket over his lap. Isabella wondered if his health was not good. The Duchess was sitting next to her son at a card table and got up to embrace her daughter at her entrance. Jacqueline gave her grandmother a very proper curtsy before giving her a light hug. Lady Abigail shared many of her father's sharp facial features, but it was clear that her petite frame and lush, dark red hair was her mother's. Though she looked to be at least 10 years younger than her husband, the Duchess had some grey streaks running through the rich auburn hair that fell in little curls around a bandeau. Isabella could see that Jacqueline was just as nervous as she when standing before her grandfather. She gave a deep curtsy and, as clear as a bell, said, "Good evening, Your Grace. You are looking very well." Isabella wondered at the sentence that she had encouraged Jacqueline to practice over and over till it was perfect. Upon closer examination, he didn't look well at all. "And tell me what you learned, young lady," he said in response, no light in his eyes. The whole of the room was watching this exchange with joy, and yet the Duke didn't seem as moved as all the others by her angelic face. Jacqueline looked back to her governess, who stood just behind her. Isabella gave a reassuring nod for encouragement. "I have learned to count and recite the Lord's Prayer." "Well then, let's hear this," the Duke said, putting aside the book he had been reading. He spoke with some skepticism, which discouraged the girl. Isabella took a step forward and, bending down, encouraged the child onward. In Isabella's eyes, she did wonderfully. Lady Abigail and her Grace even clapped when Jacqueline finished the Lord's Prayer, though she had stumbled once. The Duke said nothing to the child. "You seem to be making good progress, Miss Watts," was all he said before returning to his reading. "Thank you, Your Grace," she responded, taking the child's hand and preparing to leave. "Jacqueline, won't you come over here and show Mother how you drew that pretty flower the other day?" Lord Belford said from his card table. "Oh yes, I would love to see a drawing," Duchess Wintercrest announced, putting her card game aside. A servant produced a small writing desk with tools, and Jacqueline went to sit by her grandmother. Isabella wasn't exactly sure what to do. She was told to keep charge of the child for the night, but didn't know if she should stay or excuse herself. When Jacqueline had gone to the Duchess, Isabella had been invited to sit. She had taken a wooden chair against the wall, so as not to intrude on the intimacy of the family. After a few minutes, Lady Abigail had joined her mother, brother and niece at the card table and was attempting to teach little Jacqueline a simple card game. "Miss Watts, do you play the piano at all?" Duchess Wintercrest asked. "Yes, Your Grace." "Would you play for us now?" she asked sweetly, motioning to a pianoforte just to the side of Isabella. "My daughter did not take to lessons, and I so miss the sound of music in the evening." "Of course, Your Grace," Isabella said, taking a seat at the piano. There was already sheet music laid out. Another servant appeared wordlessly and placed a small candelabra on the pianoforte to give her the best light. "Thank you," she said to the man she hadn't met yet. He nodded and returned to the corner of the room where he stood waiting. The music was simple enough, and Isabella recognised it as a sonata by Pleyel that she had learned in her youth. She played softly in the background to amuse the Duchess but not to distract them from their evening together. She got so lost in concentration over the notes that she didn't even notice when Lord Bellfourd came to stand next to her. She came to a part on the page that she couldn't quite see, due to the previous page covering it partially. Before she even had time to react, a hand reached forward and fixed the offending page. "I suppose you have come to tease me some more," Isabella said without stopping her playing. She had become entirely used to his teasing manner over the week, during his various visits with his niece, and had found herself becoming quite comfortable around him. "I would do no such thing," Lord Belfourd said, feigning shock. "I came to admire your wonderful playing. Perhaps you will teach Jackie to play as well." "I am not sure if she is old enough at the moment, but certainly I would be happy to teach her in the future." "I suppose you are right, though it is a pity." "A pity? Why is that, Lord Belford?" "Well, I had hoped you could teach her and have a song ready for when I return in the fall." "Return? Where are you going, Christian?" Lady Abigail chimed in, overhearing the conversation. "To town for the season, of course," Lady Wintercrest answered. "Your father is not well enough to go this year for Parliament. Christian will oversee what is needed." "Can't I go as well, then? I know we agreed that I wouldn't go this year since you will be here with father, but if Christian is going—" Isabella continued to play, but her heart went out to Lady Abigail. Indeed, any girl of her age would be dying to leave the country for the society of the season. "I do not feel comfortable allowing you to go without a chaperone," the Duke chimed in, not once glancing up from his book. It was the final word on the matter. Lady Wintercrest took her daughter's hand in comfort and tried to encourage her with thoughts of summer in the country. Isabella was surprised at how disappointed she felt, knowing that Lord Belfourd would be leaving for the season. She wondered if it was perhaps just jealousy that he was going to enjoy the society that she had once had. She felt it was more than that, though. She would miss his company, and the smiles he brought to not only his niece, but also Mrs. Murray and herself on his visits. "I can do my best to find something simple for Miss Jacqueline to learn in order to celebrate your return," she said as she ended her piece. She looked up at Lord Belfourd to see his bright blue eyes smiling down at her. "I would appreciate that very much. I know Jackie would love it also," he said, with gratitude that made Isabella's heart swell. She was quite confident that he had asked purely because he knew that to do such a thing for her uncle's homecoming would make Jacqueline feel so dignified. It would give her a place as part of the family. Chapter 9. Sunday morning, Isabella made ready to escort little Jackie, as she too had begun to call her, to church with her family. The estate had its own private chapel for the families and servants to attend. Isabella had already found it once, tucked away in a grove of trees when walking with Jackie. It had looked spectacularly old and beautiful all at the same time. They had wandered around the small family graveyard next to it and even found Lord James buried there. The following day, they collected some wildflowers to place on the grave. Though Jackie had never met her father, Isabella thought it might be important for her to come and visit the gravesite from time to time. Isabella was also excited because, for the first time since she had arrived a week ago, the clouds had finally parted, and there was glorious sun shining down on God's beautiful green earth. She was sure that, though it was only a half-mile walk to the churchyard, the family would be riding in a carriage. She decided that Jackie and she would walk and absorb some of the glorious sunshine. For this reason, she had opted to wear a light cotton walking dress instead of the more delicate gowns that she might have worn to church back at Rosewater. She put on a full-brim summer bonnet and her only pair of sturdy leather half-boots. Adding a light shawl, she felt she was ready for the brisk walk to church. She came to pick up her little pupil from Mrs. Murray and found her to be just as adequately dressed. She wore a fine cream-coloured cotton dress with patterns of bluebells in striped fashion. It did wonders to bring out the clarity of the child's azure eyes. She, too, was wearing sturdy leather boots instead of silk slippers, and even had a matching parasol for her and her little Dolly, who sat by the window at the tea table to await their return. Taking the child's hand, Isabella thanked Mrs. Murray for all her efforts and skipped along down the stairs and out to the church. They arrived at the churchyard just as a fine barouche came rolling up on the main road. It was gleaming in the sunlight with a Wintercrest coat of arms painted on the side. 2 cream-coloured horses trotted along in front. Inside, the Duchess, Duke, and their 2 children were sparkling in their most excellent wear. Isabella heard Jackie give an audible awe sound as the carriage came around and pulled in front of the chapel. "Doesn't her Grace look just like a queen?" Jackie whispered to her governess. "Well, if that is true, then I shall have to start calling you Princess Jackie," Isabella said in return. The little girl laughed at the thought of being a princess and began to dance and twirl her small umbrella around the courtyard. Isabella, however, watched as Lord Bellfourd left the carriage first and then helped both his sister and mother in turn. After they were safely out of the transport, he grabbed a cane situated for his father and made sure that he too made it out safely. She studied Lord Bellfourd for a moment. Today more than ever he looked like the real Marquess of Bellfourd. He was wearing high dark brown boots, tan pantaloons, a dark navy waistcoat, and long black tailcoat. He looked dashing with his silk top hat, his hair pulled back with a simple navy blue ribbon. It quite caught Isabella's breath to watch him. She had to tell herself to look away. He waited till his mother was adequately placed on his father's right arm before taking Lady Abigail's in his arm and escorting her in. Both Lady Abigail and he were a vast contrast to the lady and lord of the drawing-room just the night before. Even her Grace was much more poised and held an air around her. Sunday was an important affair, Isabella guessed, where their status as head of the house was put properly in its place before all the staff. The Duke, in Isabella's mind, seemed to be the one who put propriety first, and the others were only doing so on his direct wish. Sunday, apparently, was a day that no exceptions could be made, in the eyes of the Duke. In fact, on the walk over, Jackie had informed Isabella that this would be her first time attending services with the family. Without a governess to escort her, she had been instructed to stay home with her nurse. It was still a wonder to Isabella that the Duke, who had evidently brought the child to help him grieve the loss of his son, could then push her away and ostracize her from the rest of the family. The church service went quite well. The sermon was lovely and, though Jackie could understand but a little of what was said, she kept still in her place on the pew behind the Duke, Duchess, and family. Once the service was over, The servants who had followed behind the family now began to make their exit. The Duke went up to the pastor to discuss that day's service, while the rest of the family stood by. It was all so very proper that Isabella had to mentally rub her eyes to distinguish the lord before her, with the gentleman that gave little Jackie horsey rides in her schoolroom. Isabella hesitated, not sure if she should wait to present the child to the Duke again. Deciding against it, she took Jackie's hand again and proceeded on their walk back to the manor. She had scarcely left the churchyard when she heard the sound of feet quickly walking to catch up to her. She turned to see Lord Bellfourd coming their way, hat already removed and under one arm. She curtsied respectfully to him. "Lord Bellfourd." "Miss Watts," he said, coming up to her. "I couldn't bear to ride, even in an open carriage, on such an exceptional day. Would it be all right if I accompany little Jackie on her walk back home?" "Oui, please, Miss Watts. May he?" Jackie asked, swinging her little arm in Isabella's. "Of course," Isabella said, releasing the child and allowing her to hug her uncle. Isabella watched them walk a few steps ahead before Lord Bellfourd stopped and turned back to her. "Surely you will accompany us as well, Miss Watts." Lord Bellfourd had walked the gardens twice already with little Jackie and Isabella in the afternoons over the past week, but that was always with Mrs. Murray present as well. She wasn't sure if it would be proper to walk alone with him now. "Oui, yes please, Miss Watts. Uncle Christian will tell us l'histoire de pirates while we march." "Pirates?" Isabella asked. Now too intrigued to care for propriety, she made her way up to meet them. Without much thought to the action, Lord Bellfourd held out his free arm for Isabella to take, and she slipped her hand into its crook. It felt nice to be treated like a lady again. It may have only been a week, but it had felt so long since she had been part of the world she had grown up in. "I suppose I can tell you one tale of the high seas," Lord Bellfourd started as they walked, "but only if you promise you won't get scared." "Oui, je promets." "Bien," Lord Bellfourd said, and with a nod, then began to search his mind for a good story to share. "I will tell you of how I came to captain my own ship." He spoke with a little squint in his eyes as he expounded on his daring tale of life on a ship, the hardships, the vast emptiness, and keeping the men from mutiny against their captain. Finally, he motioned them over to a small grove of trees off the path, which opened to a lovely pond. Isabella was so entranced by his tales she hadn't even noticed the divergence from the way home. Without a blanket, Isabella and Jackie sat in the sun next to a large oak tree that Lord Bellfourd leaned on as he continued to weave his tale. "But the ship you captained, Uncle Christian, tell me of that," Jackie encouraged. "Well, you see, I had just been made a commander and was sailing on the Queen Elizabeth. She was the fastest warship yet built by the Royal Navy. We were sailing in dangerous waters between the coast of Spain and France. Napoleon had just started his reign and tension was high. Only after a few weeks out we spotted another British ship, a merchant ship. She was low in the water with cargo and we easily sped up to meet her. Only when we got to her side did we see that it was the French flag flying at her mast. She had been taken over by villainous pirates and the British crew, well the ones left, had been arrested and forced to work the ship's sails in chains." Jackie's eyes were now as big as teacups, and Lord Bellfourd smiled in pleasure. He was a fantastic storyteller indeed. "Of course we opened fire on her, determined to see her sunk or back in British hands. The battle was a fierce one. The sound of cannon fire was deafening, but there was no way for such a heavy ship to escape. Finally we boarded her, myself included. With pistol and sword in hand, we finally took control of the ship." He paused for dramatic effect. It wasn't lost on his audience. "We learned that the ship had sailed from a Spanish port set for England. It was filled with rice and spices from India. With the French pirates under control, we took back the ship. Unfortunately, the captain and first mate had been among the first executed by the pirates. The ship had no one to lead the few sailors remaining back home. The commanding officer, Captain Johnson, ordered myself and a few men of my choosing to stay on the merchant ship and see that she sailed safely home. He would navigate ahead with the speed of the Queen Elizabeth to prepare for our arrival. You see, the merchant ship was severely damaged from the fight, and assistance would be needed upon her arrival to port. It was my first command as captain of a vessel, and I couldn't have been more excited about it. We watched the Queenie sail on ahead and made ready ourselves, making any repairs as was needed. One thing that was particularly worrisome was a hole in the port side just at the waterline. Water had been spilling into her. First, we stopped the hole as best as possible, fashioning a patch with one of the smaller sails. Then we began pumping out the water. All seemed right, and we set out on our way. By the middle of the night, though, we started to hear a curious groaning from below deck. Now, all ships groan, and each one makes their own unique symphony, so we paid no attention to it. By morning, however, we noticed that the boards of the deck were moving. They had separated and swelled away from each other and began to sway with the rocking of the ship. I thought at first that the sail had not held in plugging the hole and went to inspect it over the side of the vessel. Much to my surprise, I could not see any portion of the sail in the early morning light. We had sunk so deep that it was entirely underwater now. I had my men go back down to inspect the cargo and see if it was again flooded with water. If we needed to, we would pump water day and night to keep it afloat. Though some water was dripping through the pressure of the canvas, it wasn't nearly enough to be flooding and weighing down the ship. Then I came down myself to inspect what could be the cause. I realised then that the bags of rice butted up to that particular wall of the ship. Do you know what happens to rice when it touches water? Jackie shook her head excitedly. Well, it soaks up that water and expands bigger, much like bread soaking up milk. Even though we had stopped up the plug well enough, all the bags of rice had been flooded with water and now were swelling and expanding, literally weighing the ship down and pushing on the walls of the hull. I called all my men down and began to have them haul the bags of rice away from the walls, up on the deck and over the side. It was better to get rid of the cargo than to lose the whole ship, you see. We worked for hours, carrying 50-pound bags on our shoulders, up and over the side of the boat. After a whole day of this, we seemed to be making no progress. The ship was still swelling under the weight of all the rice expanding below. The vessel had already sunk so low into the water that one could almost touch it from the deck. It was then we discovered something much more sinister. Under one of the bags of rice, along the hull, was a second hole that had been spilling in and pouring onto the bags of rice. So low was it, though, that all the water was soaked up before it even made it out past the piles of grain. I determined at this point that there was no hope to save the ship. We had to abandon ship in the middle of the sea with little hope of being rescued. I piled my men, the merchant sailors, and the imprisoned French pirates onto 3 lifeboats. I had been captain for only 24 hours before having to give my post to the depths of the sea. "What happened to you?" Isabella asked, forgetting herself. She was so enraptured by the tale she had forgotten he was telling the story for the benefit of Jackie, not herself. She blushed. "Sorry." "No, don't be," Lord Belford said with a soft smile. He turned back to Jackie to finish the story, but now glanced at Miss Watts from time to time. "We were in our lifeboats for 3 days. We tied them together to keep from losing each other. I had taken the boat with the prisoners to keep them from revolting. On the night of the 3rd day, a great storm came and blew us around like a cork in a bottle all night long. By morning we were still together but had no idea where we were. Did we get pushed back towards France? Had we blown south towards the tip of Spain, or perhaps did Poseidon himself give us this storm to hurry us on home? Which one was it, Uncle?" "France, sadly," he said, to both of our audible gasps. We had just spotted the coast, maybe 20 miles in the distance, when a French ship made its way from a port, no doubt spying on us. Fearing capture ourselves, I did the only thing I could think of. I cut my boat with the prisoners loose, hopped on a boat with my own men, and rowed for our very lives in the opposite direction. Certainly our only hope was that the French would take their own men and leave us be. We weren't entirely sure we would be so lucky when out of the west came Queenie herself, back for another round of patrol. They had expected us to be in port with the merchant ship by then, and were surprised to find us floating so close to France in nothing but little rowboats. They scooped us up, and we were again in the safety of Queen Elizabeth's belly. "And so for one day you were captain of a ship," Isabella said with awe. "Well, technically 4, because I captained the rowboats as well," he said with a twinkle in his eye. Both girls giggled at this. The commanding officer of the Queenie so appreciated the care I took of the men on the ship that he recommended me for captain on our next port call. A year later, it was made official. "I can imagine so. To keep such a clear head in the midst of one travesty after the other," Isabella said in awe. "Did you find any mermaids?" Jackie asked on an entirely different train of thought. "Loads," Lord Bellfourd said, standing and helping little Jackie out of the grass. "Only you had to stay away from them. They would sing you into a trance until you sailed your boat onto unseen rocks." "Mermaids don't do that," Jackie said, quite sure of herself. "Oh, pardon me, you're right, they were sirens," he said, offering a hand to Miss Watts as well. "Sirens, you say?" Isabella retorted sceptically, taking his hand. "Yes. I always seem to find myself entranced by beautiful women raised under the influence of the seas." Isabella blushed immensely as he pierced her with his eyes. Finally, he turned to little Jackie and whispered, "The green-eyed ones are by far the hardest to ignore." She giggled. "Uncle Christian, I think you are making that up. There are no such things as sirens." "Oh, yes, there are. You must ask your governess to tell you all about them next week," he said with a wicked grin in Isabella's direction.
Scan the QR code or click on the link in the description to read the full book. The full audiobook will be available on YouTube in a few days. What did you like the most? Comment below and share this video on your social media and with your friends. Watch one of the following videos. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and hit the notification bell to not miss any new audiobooks. Thank you for watching.